Forbidden history, the forgotten daughters of Adam and Eve. In the beginning, when the world was young and untouched by the weight of centuries, there existed a family whose story would echo through all of human history. We know their names well, or at least we think we do. Adam, the first man, formed from dust and brought to life by divine breath. Eve, the first woman, crafted from Adam's rib to be his companion. Their sons, Cain and Abel, whose tale of jealousy and murder marks humanity's first step into darkness. But hidden in the shadows of this ancient narrative lies a mystery that has puzzled scholars and believers for thousands of years. What if everything you thought you knew about the first family was incomplete? What if there were others, forgotten by time, erased from common memory, yet absolutely essential to the continuation of our species? Today, we're diving deep into one of Scripture's most intriguing puzzles, a question that has sparked debates in theological circles for centuries and continues to challenge our understanding of humanity's earliest days. The question is simple, yet its implications are staggering. If Adam and Eve were the first and only humans created by God, and if their sons Cain and Abel were among their first children, then how did Cain find a wife? Where did she come from? And more importantly, who were the forgotten daughters of Eden, whose stories were never told, whose names were never recorded, yet whose very existence may hold the key to understanding our origins? This isn't just an academic exercise or a theological curiosity. This mystery touches the very foundation of human history, challenging us to look beyond the surface of familiar stories and discover truths that have been hiding in plain sight. The answers we uncover today might surprise you, might even shock you, and will certainly change the way you think about the earliest chapters of human existence. Before we embark on this journey together, let me be clear about what we're exploring. We're not here to undermine faith or challenge the sacred nature of Scripture. Instead, we're seeking to understand the fullness of what these ancient texts reveal, including the details that are often overlooked or forgotten. We're investigating the spaces between the verses, the silences that speak as loudly as the words themselves. The story begins in a garden, a place of perfect harmony, where the first humans walked with their Creator in the cool of the evening. This wasn't just any garden, but Eden, a paradise beyond our wildest imagination, where every tree was pleasant to sight and good for food, where rivers flowed to water the earth, and where death had not yet entered the world. Adam and Eve lived in this perfection, naked and unashamed, their hearts pure, and their relationship with God unbroken. They were given dominion over every living creature, tasked with tending and keeping the garden, and commanded to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. In this divine mandate lay the seeds of everything that would follow, including the mystery we're about to unravel. Their fall from grace is a story we all know. The serpent's temptation, the forbidden fruit, the sudden awareness of their nakedness, the shame, the hiding from God's presence. With their disobedience came consequences that would ripple through all of human history. They were expelled from Eden, barred from the tree of life, and sentenced to lives of toil and eventual death. But even in judgment, there was mercy. Even as they faced the consequences of their choices, God promised that from Eve's offspring would come one who would crush the serpent's head. Hope was planted even in the moment of greatest despair, a promise that would unfold across the generations to come. Soon after their expulsion, Eve conceived and gave birth to their first son, Cain. Her words at his birth are recorded for us, filled with wonder and gratitude, as she declared that she had acquired a man from the Lord. This was no ordinary birth, but the first human birth in history, the beginning of the human family as we know it. Cain was followed by his brother Abel, and these two boys grew up in a world vastly different from the paradise their parents had known, where their parents had walked with God in perfect communion, Cain and Abel knew only a world touched by sin, where the ground yielded its fruit grudgingly, where thorns and thistles competed with crops, and where the very fabric of creation groaned under the weight of the fall. The two brothers chose different paths in life. Cain became a tiller of the ground, working the soil that had been cursed because of his parents' disobedience. Abel became a keeper of sheep, tending flocks under the open sky. Both were honest occupations, both necessary for survival in their new reality. Yet these different callings would ultimately lead to tragedy. When the time came to offer sacrifices to God, both brothers brought gifts from their labor. Cain offered fruits of the ground, the produce of his fields and orchards. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, the best of what he had to offer. But while Abel's offering was accepted by God, Cain's was not. The reason for this rejection has been debated for millennia, but the scriptures suggest it had less to do with what was offered and more to do with the heart behind the offering. God's rejection of his sacrifice filled Cain with anger and resentment. His countenance fell, and jealousy began to eat away at his soul like a cancer. In a moment of divine compassion, God approached Cain with a warning that rings across the ages like thunder. "Why are you angry?" God asked. "If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." This was more than a warning. It was an invitation to repentance, a chance for Cain to choose a different path. But the poison of jealousy had already taken root too deeply. Instead of examining his own heart, instead of seeking to understand why his offering had been rejected, Cain chose to blame his brother for his own spiritual failure. What happened next would forever change the trajectory of human history. Cain invited Abel to walk with him in the field, away from their parents' home, away from any witnesses. There, in a moment of rage that had been building like a storm, Cain raised his hand against his brother and struck him down. The first murder had been committed, brother against brother, and the ground that had already been cursed to produce thorns now drank human blood for the first time. When God came seeking Abel, asking Cain where his brother was, Cain's response revealed the depth of his spiritual decay. "I do not know," he lied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The man who should have been his brother's protector had become his destroyer, and now he compounded his sin with deception and defiance. But God, who sees all and knows all, was not deceived. "What have you done?" he demanded. "The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Justice would not be denied, and consequences would follow. The ground that had drunk Abel's blood would no longer yield its strength to Cain. He would become a fugitive and a vagabond, wandering the earth without rest or peace. Cain's response to this judgment reveals something crucial to our mystery. "My punishment is greater than I can bear," he cried out. "You have driven me out this day from the face of the ground, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." Stop and consider those words carefully. Anyone who finds me will kill me. Who was Cain talking about? If Adam and Eve were the only humans on earth, and if Abel was now dead, who were these others that Cain feared would seek vengeance upon him? This single statement opens a window into a reality that the surface reading of Scripture doesn't immediately reveal. God's response is equally intriguing. Rather than dismissing Cain's fears as irrational, God took them seriously. He placed a mark upon Cain, a sign that would protect him from the vengeance of others. "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold," God declared. But why would such protection be necessary if there were no others to fear? The mystery deepens when we follow Cain's story further. After receiving the mark of protection, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The very name Nod means wandering, reflecting his cursed state as a fugitive But then something unexpected happens in the narrative. The text tells us simply, "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch." There it is, stated matter-of-factly, as if it's the most natural thing in the world. But for anyone paying attention, this raises the most profound question imaginable. Where did this wife come from? Who was she? How could Cain, the exiled murderer, suddenly have a wife in a world where supposedly only his parents still lived? This question has echoed through centuries of biblical scholarship and theological debate. Some have suggested that there were other humans created separately from Adam and Eve, though this contradicts the clear biblical teaching that all humanity descends from the first couple. Others have proposed that Cain waited many years before marrying, allowing time for his parents to have more children, including daughters who could become wives for their brothers. But perhaps the most overlooked aspect of this mystery lies in what Scripture doesn't explicitly tell us about Adam and Eve's family. We know about Cain and Abel because their story is dramatic and tragic, marking a crucial turning point in human history. We know about Seth because he was born to replace Abel and continue the righteous line. But what about the others? The text gives us a tantalizing hint in its description of Adam's later years. We're told that after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 more years and had sons and daughters. Sons and daughters, plural, unnamed but essential to the human story. If Adam lived for a total of 930 years, and if he remained fertile for much of that time, how many children might he and Eve have had over the centuries? This is where our mystery truly begins to unfold, in the silence between the verses, in the unnamed daughters whose stories were never told, but whose existence was absolutely necessary for humanity's survival and growth. These forgotten women of Eden hold the key to understanding not just Cain's wife, but the entire early expansion of the human race. Consider the world these early generations inhabited. It was a world without nations or tribes, without established communities beyond the extended family. Marriage between close relatives wasn't just acceptable in such circumstances, it was the only option available. The genetic concerns that make such unions problematic today didn't apply in those early generations when the human genome was still close to its original perfection. We need to understand that the world of Adam and Eve's children was fundamentally different from our own. This wasn't a world where you could travel to distant lands and meet people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different bloodlines. This was a world where everyone who existed shared the same parents, the same origin, the same divine spark that had been breathed into Adam's nostrils at the dawn of creation. In this context, the daughters of Adam and Eve weren't just family members. They were the mothers of nations, the carriers of humanity's future, the links in an unbroken chain that would stretch from Eden to every corner of the earth. Yet their names have been lost to time, their stories relegated to footnotes and speculation, their contributions to human history largely forgotten. But why were these women forgotten? Why do we know the names of their brothers but not their own? The answer lies partly in the ancient world's focus on patriarchal lineages, where family histories were traced through male descendants. But it also reflects something deeper about how we remember history itself. We remember the dramatic moments, the conflicts, the turning points. We remember Cain because he committed the first murder. We remember Abel because he was the first victim. We remember Seth because he continued the righteous line. But the quiet contributions of women, their roles as wives and mothers, and keepers of family traditions, often fade into the background of grand narratives. This forgetting has cost us dearly. By overlooking the daughters of Eden, we've missed crucial pieces of the human puzzle. We've failed to understand how quickly the early human population could have grown, how complex the family relationships might have been, and how the patterns established in those first generations would echo through all of subsequent history. Let's consider what we can deduce about these forgotten daughters from the clues scattered throughout Scripture. First, we know they existed. The text explicitly states that Adam had daughters, and simple logic tells us that for humanity to multiply and fill the earth, as God commanded, there had to be women to bear children. These weren't optional extras in the human story. They were absolutely essential. Second, we can infer that there were probably many of them. If Adam lived for 930 years and remained fertile for much of that time, if Eve bore children across centuries rather than decades, the number of daughters could have been substantial. Some traditions suggest that Adam and Eve had dozens of children, perhaps even more than 100 over their long lifespans. Third, these daughters would have been born across many centuries, creating complex generational relationships. A daughter born early in Adam's life might have been old enough to be a grandmother by the time another daughter was born centuries later. This means that when we talk about Cain's wife, we're not necessarily talking about his immediate sister, but possibly about a woman born much later, perhaps even a great-niece or grandniece. The implications of this generational spread are staggering. By the time Cain was exiled to the land of Nod, the earth might not have been as sparsely populated as we often imagine. If Adam and Eve had been fruitful and multiplying for decades or even centuries, there could have been dozens, perhaps hundreds of their descendants scattered across the world. Some might have migrated far from Eden, establishing settlements in distant lands. Others might have remained closer to their parents' home, creating the first human communities. This population growth would explain many of the puzzling elements in Cain's story. It would explain his fear of being killed by others, his ability to find a wife in the land of Nod, and his capacity to build a city. Cities aren't built by solitary individuals. They require communities, populations, organized societies. If Cain could build a city and name it after his son Enoch, there had to be people to inhabit it. But who were these people? The most logical answer is that they were his extended family, descendants of Adam and Eve, who had spread across the earth over the generations. They might have been his sisters and brothers, his nieces and nephews, his cousins and their children. In a world where everyone shared common ancestry, the entire human population would have been one vast, interconnected family. This brings us to one of the most sensitive aspects of our investigation. If Cain's wife was indeed one of his relatives, possibly even his sister, how do we reconcile this with modern moral sensibilities? The answer requires us to understand the unique circumstances of humanity's earliest generations and the progressive nature of divine revelation. In the beginning, when the human gene pool was pure and uncorrupted, marriages between close relatives carried none of the genetic risks we associate with them today. Adam and Eve were created perfect, their DNA unblemished by the mutations and defects that have accumulated over thousands of years of human history. Their immediate descendants would have inherited this genetic purity, making marriages between siblings not only safe, but necessary for the continuation of the species. Moreover, God's moral laws were revealed progressively throughout history. The prohibitions against marrying close relatives that we find in the Mosaic Law weren't given until thousands of years after Adam and Eve, long after the human population had grown large enough to make such restrictions practical. What was necessary and permissible in humanity's infancy became restricted as civilization matured and circumstances changed. We see this pattern repeated throughout biblical history. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, and their union was blessed by God. Isaac married his cousin Rebekah. Jacob married two of his cousins, Leah and Rachel. These weren't scandalous relationships. They were normal and even preferred arrangements in their cultural context. It was only later, as populations grew and mixed, that such close marriages became problematic, both genetically and socially. The daughters of Adam and Eve lived in this early world where close family marriages weren't just acceptable, but essential. They were the pioneers of human civilization, the first women to experience pregnancy and childbirth, the first mothers to raise children in a world touched by sin and death. Their experiences would have been unique in all of human history, filled with discoveries and challenges that no woman before or since has faced. Imagine being the first daughter of Adam and Eve, the first granddaughter of creation itself. You would have grown up hearing stories of Eden directly from those who had lived there. You would have seen the scars on your parents' faces when they spoke of their lost paradise, the weight of regret and longing in their eyes. You would have been raised with the knowledge that the world you inhabited was a shadow of what it was meant to be, yet also with the hope that someday, somehow, paradise might be restored. These women would have been the keepers of humanity's earliest memories, the transmitters of stories and wisdom from generation to generation. In a world without writing, without books, without any way to preserve knowledge except through oral tradition, the role of mothers and grandmothers in passing down essential information would have been crucial. They would have taught their children about God, about right and wrong, about the consequences of disobedience, and about the promise of redemption that God had given even in the moment of judgment. Some of these daughters might have witnessed the tragic confrontation between Cain and Abel. They might have seen the jealousy building in their brother's heart, perhaps even tried to intervene or warn Abel of the danger. They would have experienced the shock and horror of the first murder, the grief of losing a beloved brother, and the complex emotions surrounding Cain's exile. Some might have wept for him, even as they recoiled from his crime, understanding that the brother they had loved was now lost to them forever. Others among these forgotten daughters might have lived to see the birth of Seth, the replacement for Abel, the one through whom the righteous line would continue. They might have helped Eve through the difficult pregnancy and birth, understanding as perhaps no one else could the mixture of hope and fear that must have filled the first mother's heart. Would this child be different? Would he choose the path of righteousness that Abel had walked, or would he follow Cain into darkness? As the generations passed and the human population grew, these daughters would have seen their own children and grandchildren spreading across the earth, establishing new settlements, developing new technologies, creating the foundations of human civilization. They would have been among the first to experience the joys and sorrows of extended family relationships, watching as their descendants intermarried and formed complex kinship networks that would span continents. Some scholars and ancient traditions have attempted to preserve the names and stories of these forgotten women. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient text that expands on the Genesis narratives, provides names for several of Adam and Eve's daughters. According to this source, Cain married a sister named Awan, while Seth married another sister called Azura. These names, whether historically accurate or not, give faces to the faceless, identities to the anonymous, and help us imagine these women as real people rather than mere footnotes to their brothers' stories. Awan, if she was indeed Cain's wife, would have faced unimaginable challenges. She would have been married to a man marked by God, exiled from his family, cursed to wander the earth without rest. She would have followed him into the land of Nod, far from everything familiar, far from the safety and comfort of home. She would have borne his children in exile, raised them in a strange land, and helped him build the first city in human history. Her life would have been one of courage and resilience, of loyalty tested by the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Azura, as Seth's wife, would have had a different but equally important role. She would have been the mother of the righteous line, the ancestor of Noah, Abraham, and ultimately of Christ himself. Through her womb would pass the genetic and spiritual heritage that would preserve God's covenant through all the dark centuries to come. She would have raised her children with the knowledge that they carried a special responsibility, that through them God's promises to humanity would be fulfilled. But these are just two names among many. If Adam and Eve truly had dozens of daughters across their long lifespans, then there were dozens of other stories, dozens of other lives lived in faith and courage, dozens of other contributions to the human story that have been lost to time. Each of these women would have been unique, with her own personality, her own dreams, her own relationship with God and family. Some might have been natural leaders, taking charge of household management and child rearing with confident authority. Others might have been gentle spirits, drawn to prayer and contemplation, keeping alive the memory of Eden through their devotion to God. Still others might have been innovators, developing new techniques for cooking, weaving, agriculture, or medicine. All would have been essential to humanity's survival and growth in those crucial early generations. The tragedy is that we've lost their voices. We don't know what they thought about the great events of their time, how they felt about their brothers' conflicts, what hopes they held for their children's futures. We don't know their fears or their joys, their struggles or their triumphs. They've been silenced by history, reduced to anonymous supporting characters in their brothers' stories. Yet in another sense, their voices echo through every generation that has followed. Every human being who has ever lived carries their genetic heritage, their biological legacy passed down through thousands of years of human history. Every act of courage, every expression of love, every moment of faith can be traced back in some small way to these forgotten mothers of humanity. Their silence in Scripture doesn't mean they were silent in life. It doesn't mean their contributions were less important than their brothers, or that their stories were less worthy of remembering. It simply means that the purposes of Scripture were different from the purposes of comprehensive history. The Bible tells us what we need to know for our spiritual journey, not necessarily everything we might want to know about the past. But perhaps that's changing. Perhaps in our time, when we're more aware of the importance of women's stories and contributions, we can begin to recover something of what was lost. We can read between the lines of Scripture, imagining the lives and experiences of these forgotten daughters. We can honor their memory by acknowledging their essential role in humanity's story. We can recognize that without them, there would be no us. The mystery of Cain's wife, then, isn't really a mystery at all. It's a window into a world we've forgotten, a reminder of the complex family relationships that characterized humanity's earliest generations. It's an invitation to look beyond the surface of familiar stories and discover the deeper truths they contain. Most importantly, it's a call to remember that every person in those ancient narratives was a real human being, with real experiences, real relationships, and real contributions to make to the unfolding story of our species. As we continue to explore this forgotten history, we'll discover that the implications reach far beyond questions of ancient genealogy. The patterns established in those first generations, the choices made by those early humans, the relationships they formed, and the traditions they established, all of these continue to shape our world today in ways we're only beginning to understand. The forgotten daughters weren't just witnesses to history, they were architects of it. While their brothers' names echo through Scripture, and their deeds are remembered in vivid detail, these women were quietly building the foundation upon which all future generations would stand. They were the first to experience the profound mysteries of womanhood in a fallen world, the first to navigate the complex dynamics of family relationships when family meant literally everyone alive. Picture Arwan, if indeed she was Cain's wife, making the decision to follow him into exile. This wasn't just leaving home. This was leaving the only human community that existed. She would have walked away from her parents, her siblings, everything familiar and safe, to journey with a man marked by God himself. What kind of love, what depth of commitment would drive such a choice? And what kind of strength would it take to build a new life in the wilderness, to bear children in a land of wandering, to create hope where there seemed to be none? Consider the conversations she might have had with Cain during those long nights in the land of Nod. Did she try to comfort him when the weight of his brother's blood pressed heavy on his conscience? Did she encourage him when the cursed ground refused to yield its fruit? Did she hold him when nightmares of Abel's face haunted his sleep? Or did she sometimes fear the man she had married, wondering if the rage that had destroyed his brother might one day turn toward her? The text tells us that Cain built a city, but cities aren't built by one man alone. Arwan would have been his partner in this endeavor, helping to plan and organize, to create systems of governance and community life. She would have been among the first urban planners in human history, helping to establish the patterns of civilization that would spread across the earth. When their son Enoch was born, she would have been the first mother to raise a child in a city rather than in the countryside where her own childhood had been spent. But Awan represents just one thread in the tapestry of these forgotten lives. What about the daughters who remained closer to home, who married brothers other than Cain? They would have faced different challenges, but equally profound ones. Imagine being the sister who had to comfort your parents after Abel's murder and Cain's exile. Imagine helping your mother Eve process the unthinkable reality that one of her children had killed another, that the family she had hoped would fill the earth with righteousness had been shattered by violence and hatred. These daughters would have been the keepers of family memory, the ones who preserved the stories of Eden for future generations. They would have listened to their parents' descriptions of paradise with the kind of attention we reserve for the most precious treasures, knowing that these memories were all that remained of humanity's perfect beginning. They would have asked questions about the trees, the rivers, the animals, the presence of God himself walking in the garden in the cool of the day. As Adam and Eve aged, and remember, they lived for centuries, these daughters would have become the primary caregivers, the ones who tended to their parents' needs and helped preserve their wisdom. They would have been present at Adam's deathbed after 930 years of life, the first humans to experience the loss of a parent, the first to grapple with the reality that even the father of all humanity was mortal. The emotional weight these women carried must have been staggering. They lived through the transition from a world where death was unknown to a world where death was inevitable. They watched their parents age and decline, saw the gradual accumulation of sorrows and regrets that comes with a long life, lived outside of paradise. They would have been the first to comfort the grieving, the first to develop rituals around death and burial, the first to wrestle with questions about what comes after this life ends. Some of these daughters might have possessed special gifts or callings. In a world where divine communication was still relatively direct, where God still spoke to humans in ways that would later become rare, some of these women might have been prophetesses or visionaries. They might have received dreams or visions about the future of humanity, glimpses of the redemption that God had promised would one day come through Eve's offspring. Others might have been innovators in practical matters, the development of agriculture, animal husbandry, cooking techniques, textile production, medicine. All of these essential technologies would have emerged during these early generations, and women would have played crucial roles in their development. The first bread baker, the first weaver, the first herbalist who discovered which plants could heal and which could harm. These pioneers were likely among Adam and Eve's forgotten daughters. The complexity of family relationships in these early generations would have been unlike anything we can fully comprehend today. Imagine family gatherings where your siblings were also your in-laws, where your children were cousins to their own aunts and uncles, where generational lines blurred in ways that would make modern genealogists weep with frustration. These daughters would have navigated these relationships with wisdom and grace, establishing customs and traditions that would help maintain family harmony across multiple generations. They would have been the first wedding planners, organizing the ceremonies that united their siblings in marriage. They would have been the first midwives, helping their sisters and sisters-in-law through the dangers of childbirth in a world without medical knowledge. They would have been the first teachers, passing on essential skills and knowledge to the children who would carry humanity forward. But perhaps most importantly, they would have been the first to grapple with the spiritual implications of living in a fallen world. While their parents remembered Eden and could compare their current existence to what had been lost, these daughters knew only the world of thorns and thistles, of painful childbirth and hard labor. Yet they also inherited the promise of redemption, the hope that someday the damage would be repaired and paradise would be restored. How did they maintain faith in such a promise when the evidence of their daily lives suggested that things were getting worse rather than better? How did they find hope when their brother murdered their brother, when their family was torn apart by jealousy and violence, when the very ground seemed to resist their efforts to make it fruitful. The fact that they did maintain faith, that they continued to bear children and build communities and worship God, speaks to a kind of spiritual strength that we can barely imagine. These women would have been the first theologians, wrestling with questions about the nature of God, the meaning of suffering, the purpose of human existence. They would have developed the first theodicies, the first attempts to explain why a good God would allow evil to exist in his creation. Their conversations around evening fires, their whispered prayers in moments of desperation, their songs of hope in times of darkness. All of this theological reflection has been lost to us, but it formed the foundation of human religious thought. The genetic implications of their choices would have been profound as well. Every human being who has ever lived carries DNA that passed through these women's bodies. The genetic diversity of our entire species was filtered through their reproductive decisions, their choices of partners, their success or failure in bearing healthy children to adulthood. In a very real sense, they were the genetic bottleneck through which all of humanity passed. This means that their health, their longevity, their resistance to disease, their intelligence, their physical capabilities, all of these traits would have had outsized influence on the entire future of our species. If one of these daughters was particularly resilient or intelligent or long-lived, those traits might have spread through large portions of the human population. If another struggled with illness or died young, entire genetic lines might have been lost forever. The responsibility they bore was cosmic in scope. They weren't just making personal choices about marriage and childbirth. They were shaping the biological destiny of humanity itself. Yet they made these choices without any understanding of genetics or heredity, guided only by their hearts, their circumstances, and whatever divine guidance they might have received. As the generations passed and the human population grew, these daughters would have watched their descendants spread across the earth, carrying with them the knowledge, the traditions, the genetic heritage that had been passed down from Eden. They would have seen the first migrations, the first explorations, the first attempts to establish human settlements in distant lands. Some of their children and grandchildren would have been adventurers, pushing the boundaries of the known world. Others would have been homebodies, preferring the security of familiar territory. The diversity of human temperament and capability that we see today would have first emerged in these early generations. Some of these daughters would have given birth to children who were natural leaders, others to artists or craftsmen or warriors or priests. The full spectrum of human potential was present from the beginning, waiting to unfold as circumstances allowed and encouraged different gifts to emerge. They would have been the first to experience the heartbreak of watching their children make terrible choices. Just as Eve had watched Cain descend into jealousy and murder, these daughters would have seen their own offspring struggle with temptation, sometimes succeeding in choosing righteousness, sometimes falling into patterns of selfishness and violence. They would have learned that even the best parenting, even the most careful teaching and modeling, couldn't guarantee that their children would walk in wisdom. This would have been one of their greatest sources of sorrow and one of their most important lessons. The knowledge that each human being must choose their own path, that neither genetic heritage nor family environment can ultimately determine a person's moral destiny, would have been learned first by these forgotten mothers. They would have been the first to experience the peculiar combination of pride and anxiety that comes with watching your children become adults and make their own decisions about how to live. The religious traditions that emerged from these early families would have been profoundly shaped by women's experiences and perspectives. The first prayers, the first worship rituals, the first attempts to pass on spiritual truth to the next generation. All of this would have been heavily influenced by mothers and daughters who understood in their bones what it meant to live in a world separated from God's direct presence. They would have been the ones who preserved the memory of what worship was like in Eden, who tried to recreate in their fallen world something of the intimacy with God that their parents had known. They would have been the first to struggle with questions about how to approach a holy God when you yourself are tainted by sin. How to teach your children about divine love when the evidence of divine judgment is all around you. Their spiritual insights, their theological innovations, their practical wisdom about how to maintain faith in difficult circumstances. All of this has been lost to us, but it formed the bedrock of human religious experience. Every prayer that has ever been prayed, every act of worship that has ever been performed, every moment of spiritual insight that has ever illuminated a human heart, can be traced back in some way to the spiritual legacy of these forgotten daughters. The social structures that would eventually develop into human civilization also had their roots in the relationships these women established and maintained. The first concepts of hospitality, of community responsibility, of care for the elderly and the sick, of education for the young. All of these emerged from the practical necessities of life in those early extended families. These daughters would have been the first social workers, identifying needs within their communities and organizing responses to meet them. They would have been the first diplomats, negotiating disputes between family members and maintaining peace in situations where everyone was related to everyone else. They would have been the first economists, figuring out how to allocate limited resources fairly among competing needs and wants. The legal systems that would eventually govern human societies also had their origins in the family dynamics these women helped to establish. Questions about inheritance, about responsibility for children, about the resolution of conflicts, about punishment for wrongdoing. All of these issues would have arisen first in these early families, and the solutions that emerged would have set precedents for all future human governance. As we try to reconstruct their lives and understand their contributions, we must remember that we're dealing with real people who lived in real time, not mythological figures or symbolic representations. These women experienced joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and loss, just as intensely as any human being who has ever lived. They had personalities, preferences, dreams, disappointments. They made mistakes and learned from them. They had moments of great wisdom and moments of profound confusion. The fact that their individual stories have been lost doesn't diminish their reality or their importance. In some ways, their anonymity makes them even more representative of the human experience. Most of us, after all, will not be remembered by name in the great histories of our time. Most of us will live and die without leaving detailed records of our thoughts and experiences. Yet our lives matter, our choices have consequences, our contributions to the ongoing human story are real and significant. These forgotten daughters of Eden remind us that history is made not just by the famous figures whose names we remember, but by countless unnamed individuals whose quiet courage, whose daily faithfulness, whose ordinary acts of love and sacrifice create the conditions in which extraordinary things become possible. They were the hidden foundation upon which all of human civilization was built. Their legacy lives on, not just in our DNA, but in the patterns of human relationship, the structures of family and community, the traditions of faith and worship, the technologies of survival and flourishing that they helped to establish. Every time a mother comforts a crying child, every time a family gathers to share a meal, every time humans come together to solve problems or celebrate joys, we are echoing behaviors and relationships that were first modeled by these ancient women. The mystery of Cain's wife, then, opens up into something much larger than a simple question about ancient genealogy. It reveals the hidden half of human history, the forgotten stories of the women whose lives made all subsequent history possible. It challenges us to recognize that our understanding of the past is incomplete, that there are always voices we haven't heard, perspectives we haven't considered, contributions we haven't acknowledged. In our own time, when we're becoming more aware of how often women's stories have been marginalized or erased from historical records, the Daughters of Eden serve as a powerful reminder that this pattern of forgetting is ancient and persistent. But they also remind us that forgetting doesn't mean that the contributions weren't real, that the lives weren't lived, that the impact wasn't profound. As we move forward in our exploration of these forgotten histories, we begin to see how the patterns established in those first generations continue to echo through all the centuries that followed. The choices made by Adam and Eve's daughters, the relationships they formed, the traditions they established, the faith they maintained, all of this would influence the development of human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. The story of humanity's beginning is far richer and more complex than the familiar Sunday school versions suggest. It's a story of real people facing impossible circumstances, making difficult choices, creating solutions to problems no one had ever faced before. It's a story of courage and failure, of wisdom and folly, of love and loss. And at the heart of it all are these forgotten women, these unnamed daughters, these silent mothers who carried our entire species forward into an uncertain future. Their silence in the ancient texts doesn't diminish their voice in the ongoing human story. Every generation that has followed has carried something of their strength, their wisdom, their faith. Every human achievement, every moment of beauty, every act of love and sacrifice, every glimpse of the divine in human experience can be traced back in some way to these forgotten daughters of Eden who chose to hope when hope seemed impossible, to love when love was dangerous, to build when destruction seemed easier. They remind us that the most important work in the world is often the most invisible, that the greatest heroes are often unnamed, that the foundations of everything we value were laid by people whose names we'll never know, but whose influence we feel every day. In honoring their memory, in trying to recover something of their stories, we honor not just the past, but the present, not just ancient history, but our own ongoing participation in the great human story that they began. Their stories become even more remarkable when we consider the sheer audacity of what they accomplished. These women didn't just survive in a hostile world, they transformed it. They took the raw materials of a cursed earth and fashioned from them the beginnings of human culture, human society, human hope. Every skill that would eventually define civilization had its origins in their hands, their minds, their desperate need to create something beautiful from something broken. Think about the first woman who discovered that certain plants could ease the pain of childbirth. She had no medical textbooks, no centuries of accumulated knowledge to draw upon. She had only observation, experimentation, and the kind of intuitive wisdom that emerges from necessity. When she shared this knowledge with her sisters and daughters, she wasn't just passing along a useful tip. She was beginning the long tradition of medical science that would eventually save millions of lives. Or consider the first woman who realized that clay could be shaped and hardened to create vessels for storing food and water. This wasn't just a craft project. It was a revolution in human capability. The ability to store surplus food meant the difference between survival and starvation during harsh seasons. The ability to transport water meant that human settlements could spread beyond the immediate vicinity of rivers and springs. One woman's innovation with mud and fire changed the trajectory of human expansion across the planet. The first weaver, working with plant fibers or animal hair, wasn't just making clothing. She was creating the technology that would allow humans to survive in climates far from the temperate garden where they began. The first cook, learning to combine ingredients and apply heat in new ways, wasn't just preparing a meal. She was developing the nutritional strategies that would fuel human brain development and population growth. Each of these innovations required not just individual brilliance, but also the kind of community cooperation that these women excelled at creating. Knowledge had to be shared, techniques had to be taught, improvements had to be passed down through generations. The social networks that made such knowledge transfer possible were largely managed and maintained by women, creating the foundation for all future human learning and development. But their innovations weren't limited to practical matters. These women were also the first artists, the first storytellers, the first keepers of cultural memory. When a daughter of Adam and Eve first arranged flowers in a pleasing pattern, she wasn't just decorating, she was expressing the human need for beauty that would eventually give birth to all the visual arts. When she first sang a lullaby to comfort a crying child, she wasn't just making noise, she was creating the musical traditions that would carry human emotion and meaning across millennia. The stories they told around evening fires, the songs they hummed while working, the games they invented to entertain children, all of these seemingly simple activities were actually profound acts of cultural creation. They were establishing the patterns of human expression, the ways we would forever after use art and narrative and music to make sense of our experiences and connect with each other across the barriers of individual consciousness. Their role as the first teachers cannot be overstated. In a world without schools or books or formal educational systems, the responsibility for passing knowledge from one generation to the next fell entirely on families, and within those families, primarily on mothers. These women had to figure out not just what to teach their children, but how to teach them effectively. They had to develop pedagogical techniques, create learning experiences, find ways to make essential information memorable and meaningful. They were teaching their children how to survive, of course, which plants were safe to eat, how to avoid dangerous animals, how to find clean water, how to make fire, how to construct shelter. But they were also teaching them how to be human, how to show kindness, how to resolve conflicts, how to work together, how to maintain hope in difficult circumstances, how to worship God and live according to moral principles. This dual curriculum, the practical and the moral, established the pattern for all future human education, the recognition that technical skills must be paired with character development, that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that learning is as much about becoming a good person as it is about acquiring useful information. All of this began with these forgotten mothers trying to prepare their children for life in a fallen world. The psychological burden they carried was immense. They were raising children who would never see Eden, who would never experience the perfect communion with God that their grandparents had known. How do you explain paradise to someone who has never seen it? How do you maintain hope for restoration when every day brings fresh evidence of the world's brokenness? How do you teach faith in God's goodness when your own brother has been murdered and your family torn apart by violence? These women had to develop the first theodicies, the first explanations of why a good God allows suffering in his creation. They had to find ways to make sense of tragedy and loss that would satisfy not just their own questioning hearts, but the innocent curiosity of their children. The theological frameworks they constructed, the spiritual practices they developed, the ways they found to maintain connection with the divine despite their exile from paradise. All of this became the foundation of human religious experience. They were the first grief counselors, helping family members process the trauma of Abel's murder and Cain's exile. They were the first marriage counselors, helping siblings navigate the complex dynamics of relationships where everyone was related to everyone else. They were the first community organizers, figuring out how to maintain harmony and cooperation in extended families that might include dozens or even hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. The diplomatic skills required for such work were extraordinary. Imagine mediating a dispute between two of your brothers, both of whom are also married to your sisters, and all of whom have children who are simultaneously your nieces and nephews, and your grandchildren, and your cousins. The genealogical complexity alone would challenge modern family therapists, but these women navigated such relationships successfully enough to maintain functional communities across centuries. Their understanding of human psychology, developed through necessity and refined through experience, was remarkably sophisticated. They learned to recognize the early signs of jealousy and resentment, having seen how such emotions destroyed Cain. They developed strategies for managing conflict before it escalated to violence. They created rituals and traditions that reinforced family bonds and community solidarity. The festivals they established, the ceremonies they designed, the customs they maintained, all of these served psychological and social functions that we're only beginning to understand today. They knew intuitively what modern research has confirmed, that humans need ritual and ceremony to mark important transitions, to process difficult emotions, to maintain group cohesion, to connect with transcendent meaning. Their innovations in child rearing were equally remarkable. They were the first to grapple with questions that still challenge parents today. How do you discipline children effectively without breaking their spirits? How do you prepare them for a harsh world without destroying their innocence? How do you balance protection with independence, guidance with freedom, tradition with adaptation to changing circumstances? The parenting techniques they developed, tested through trial and error across generations, established patterns that would influence human child development for millennia. The ways they structured family life, the roles they assigned to different family members, the expectations they created for children at different stages of development, all of this became the template for human socialization. But perhaps their most remarkable achievement was maintaining hope across centuries of difficulty. These women lived through the transition from a world where death was unknown to a world where death was inevitable. They watched their parents age and decline, saw their children struggle with temptation and sometimes fall into sin, witnessed the gradual accumulation of suffering that comes with life in a broken world. Yet they continued to bear children, continued to build communities, continued to worship God, continued to believe that somehow, someday, the damage would be repaired and paradise would be restored. This wasn't naive optimism. They had seen too much tragedy for that. It was something deeper and more resilient, a faith that could acknowledge the reality of suffering while still maintaining hope for ultimate redemption. The songs they sang to comfort themselves and their children, the prayers they offered in moments of desperation, the stories they told to keep hope alive, all of this created the emotional and spiritual resources that would sustain humanity through all the dark centuries to come. They were the first to develop what we might call a theology of suffering, ways of understanding pain and loss that didn't deny their reality, but placed them within a larger framework of meaning and purpose. Their influence on the development of human language was profound as well. In those early generations, when the human population was small and concentrated, innovations in vocabulary and grammar could spread quickly through the entire species. These women were among the primary creators of the linguistic structures that would eventually diversify into all the languages of the earth. They developed the first words for emotions that hadn't existed in Eden: grief, regret, loneliness, fear, anger. They created vocabulary for new relationships: widow, orphan, exile, enemy. They invented terms for concepts that only made sense in a fallen world: justice, mercy, forgiveness, redemption. The semantic foundations of human moral discourse were largely established by their need to communicate about experiences that had no precedent in paradise. Their storytelling traditions weren't just entertainment. They were the primary means of preserving and transmitting essential information. The stories they told about Eden, about the fall, about Cain and Abel, about God's promises and judgments, became the core narratives that would shape human understanding of our origins and destiny for thousands of years. Every myth, every legend, every foundational story that would emerge in human cultures around the world can be traced back in some way to the oral traditions these women established and maintained. The economic systems that eventually developed to govern human societies also had their roots in the resource management strategies these women pioneered. In extended families where resources were limited and needs were diverse, someone had to figure out how to allocate goods fairly, how to motivate productive work, how to care for those who couldn't care for themselves, how to plan for future needs while meeting present demands. These women were the first economists, developing principles of distribution and exchange that would eventually evolve into complex market systems. They were the first bankers, managing family resources and making decisions about savings and investment. They were the first insurance agents, creating mutual support networks that would help families survive unexpected disasters. The legal principles that would eventually govern human societies also emerged from their need to maintain order and justice within their communities. Questions about property rights, about inheritance, about punishment for wrongdoing, about contracts and obligations. All of these issues arose first in these early families, and the solutions that emerged established precedents that would influence legal systems for millennia. Their understanding of justice was particularly sophisticated. Having witnessed the consequences of Cain's crime, they understood that wrongdoing must have consequences, but they also saw how punishment could destroy families and communities if it wasn't carefully managed. They developed concepts of proportionality, of mercy, of restoration, of rehabilitation that would become foundational to all future legal thinking. The medical knowledge they accumulated through observation and experimentation laid the groundwork for all future healthcare. They were the first to recognize that certain plants had healing properties, that some practices promoted health while others caused harm, that physical and emotional well-being were interconnected, that prevention was often more effective than treatment. Their role as midwives was particularly crucial. Childbirth in a fallen world was dangerous and painful, a far cry from what it would have been in Eden. These women had to learn through experience how to assist in difficult births, how to care for newborns, how to help mothers recover from the trauma of delivery. The techniques they developed, the knowledge they accumulated, the traditions they established became the foundation of obstetric care. They were also the first mental health professionals learning to recognize and treat the psychological wounds that come with life in a broken world. They developed strategies for dealing with grief, for managing anxiety, for treating depression, for helping people recover from trauma. The therapeutic techniques they pioneered, refined through generations of practice, established patterns of healing that persist to this day. Their agricultural innovations were equally important. The ground was cursed after the fall, producing thorns and thistles, requiring hard labor to yield its fruit. But these women learned to work with the land rather than against it, developing techniques of cultivation that maximized productivity while minimizing damage. They were the first to practice crop rotation, to understand the importance of soil health, to develop systems of irrigation and fertilization. They were also the first veterinarians, learning to care for the animals that had been placed under human dominion. They developed strategies for breeding healthier livestock, for preventing and treating animal diseases, for managing herds and flocks in ways that promoted both animal welfare and human benefit. The architectural principles that would eventually give rise to great cities and civilizations began with these women's innovations in domestic space. They were the first interior designers, figuring out how to arrange living spaces for maximum comfort and efficiency. They were the first urban planners, helping to organize the growing settlements that emerged as the human population expanded. When Cain built the first city, naming it after his son Enoch, the women in his community would have been crucial partners in this endeavor. Cities require more than just buildings. They require systems of governance, of resource distribution, of conflict resolution, of social organization. The expertise these women had developed in managing extended families became the foundation for managing urban communities. Their influence on the development of human technology was pervasive. Every tool, every technique, every innovation that would eventually emerge in human societies had its roots in the practical problems these women faced and solved. The need to prepare food more efficiently led to developments in cooking technology. The need to store and preserve resources led to advances in containers and preservation techniques. The need to protect families from weather and predators led to improvements in construction and fortification. But they weren't just adapting to circumstances, they were actively shaping them. Their choices about where to settle, how to organize communities, which technologies to develop and which to abandon, had profound consequences for the future direction of human civilization. They were the first to grapple with questions about the relationship between human needs and environmental constraints, about the balance between exploitation and stewardship of natural resources. The spiritual traditions that emerged from these early families bore the deep imprint of women's experiences and perspectives. The understanding of God as both just and merciful, as both transcendent and immanent, as both demanding and forgiving, was shaped by mothers who had to explain divine character to children who had never experienced paradise, but still needed to maintain faith and hope. The worship practices they developed, the prayers they composed, the rituals they established, all reflected their unique position as the bridge between Eden and exile, between the memory of perfection and the reality of brokenness. They created forms of religious expression that could acknowledge suffering without surrendering hope, that could confess sin without abandoning faith, that could petition for help without presuming upon divine mercy. Their theological insights, developed through lived experience rather than abstract speculation, provided the foundation for all future religious thought. The questions they wrestled with: why do the innocent suffer? How can a good God allow evil? What is the purpose of human existence? How should we relate to the divine? Became the central concerns of every religious tradition that would emerge in human history. As we trace their influence through the generations that followed, we begin to see how the patterns they established continue to shape human development long after their individual stories were forgotten. The social structures they created, the cultural practices they established, the technological innovations they pioneered, the spiritual insights they developed, all of this became the invisible foundation upon which all subsequent human achievement was built. Their genetic legacy was equally profound. Every human trait that we value, intelligence, creativity, resilience, compassion, courage, can be traced back to the genetic combinations that first emerged in these early generations. The diversity of human capability, the range of human potential, the very characteristics that make our species unique, all had their origins in the reproductive choices and genetic contributions of these forgotten women. They were the original selectors of human evolution, their decisions about marriage and childbearing determining which genetic lines would flourish and which would disappear. Their success or failure in raising healthy, capable children to adulthood shaped the biological destiny of our entire species. In a very real sense, we are all their descendants, carrying in our bodies and minds the accumulated wisdom of their choices. The psychological patterns they established also persisted across millennia. The ways they learned to process grief, to manage fear, to maintain hope, to build relationships, to resolve conflicts, to find meaning in suffering. All of this became part of the deep structure of human consciousness. The emotional intelligence they developed, the social skills they mastered, the spiritual resources they created, became the inherited wisdom of our species. Their legacy challenges us to reconsider our understanding of how civilization develops, how knowledge accumulates, how human potential unfolds across generations. The conventional narrative suggests that human progress has been primarily driven by great men making great discoveries, by individual genius breaking through the constraints of ignorance and tradition. But the story of these forgotten daughters suggests a different model, that the most important advances have often come from communities of ordinary people solving practical problems, that innovation emerges from the intersection of necessity and creativity, that wisdom is often generated by those whose contributions are least visible. They remind us that the work of building civilization is largely invisible, that the foundations of everything we value were laid by people whose names we don't know, but whose influence we feel every day. The technologies we depend on, the social systems we participate in, the cultural traditions we inherit, the spiritual resources we draw upon. All of this can be traced back to innovations and insights that first emerged in those early families, where these women lived and worked and loved and hoped. In our own time, When we're grappling with questions about the role of women in society, about the value of traditional knowledge, about the relationship between individual achievement and community contribution, these forgotten daughters offer a different model of significance. They show us that influence doesn't require fame, that contribution doesn't require recognition, that the most important work is often the most invisible. Their silence in the historical record doesn't diminish their voice in the ongoing human story. Every generation that has followed has carried something of their strength, their wisdom, their faith. Every human achievement, every moment of beauty, every act of love and sacrifice, every glimpse of the divine in human experience can be traced back in some way to these forgotten daughters of Eden who chose to hope when hope seemed impossible, to love when love was dangerous, to build when destruction seemed easier. They were the hidden architects of human civilization, the unnamed heroes of our species' greatest adventure. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by the famous figures whose names we remember, but by countless unnamed individuals whose quiet courage, whose daily faithfulness, whose ordinary acts of love and sacrifice create the conditions in which extraordinary things become possible. As we prepare to explore the final chapters of their story, we carry with us a deeper appreciation for the complexity and richness of human beginnings. The familiar narrative of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, has been transformed into something far more nuanced and meaningful. A story not just of individuals, but of communities, not just of men, but of women, not just of failure, but of resilience, not just of exile, but of hope. The mystery of Cain's wife has opened up into a vast landscape of forgotten history, revealing the hidden half of humanity's story. And as we'll discover, the implications of their legacy reach far beyond questions of ancient genealogy into the very heart of what it means to be human, what it means to hope, what it means to build something beautiful from something broken. The threads of their influence weave through every aspect of human development that followed, creating patterns so fundamental to our existence that we barely recognize them as achievements at all. These forgotten daughters didn't just survive the transition from paradise to exile, they transformed that exile into the foundation of everything we now call civilization. Consider for a moment the sheer audacity of their undertaking. They were tasked with nothing less than reimagining what it meant to be human in a world that no longer functioned according to the original design. Every assumption about life, about relationships, about purpose, had to be reconsidered and rebuilt from the ground up. They had no precedent to follow, no instruction manual for life after Eden, no guide except their own wisdom, and whatever divine guidance they could discern through prayer and observation. Their innovations in human relationship alone would have been sufficient to secure their place in history had their names been recorded. They were the first to navigate the complex dynamics of extended family living, where everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways simultaneously. Imagine the diplomatic skills required to maintain harmony in a community where your husband might also be your brother, where your children were simultaneously your nephews and grandchildren, where family disputes could literally tear apart the entire human race. They developed the first protocols for conflict resolution, the first systems of family governance, the first methods for allocating resources fairly among competing claims. They learned to balance individual needs against community welfare, to manage the tensions between different generations, living in close proximity, to create structures that could maintain stability while allowing for growth and change. The emotional intelligence they developed in managing these relationships was extraordinary. They learned to recognize the early warning signs of jealousy and resentment, having witnessed firsthand how such emotions had destroyed Cain. They developed strategies for channeling competitive impulses into productive activities, for transforming potential conflicts into opportunities for cooperation, for maintaining family bonds even when individual interests diverged. Their understanding of human psychology, refined through generations of practice, became the foundation for all future social organization. The customs they established for marking important life transitions, the rituals they created for processing grief and loss, the ceremonies they designed to reinforce community bonds, all of these served functions that we're only beginning to understand today through modern research into human behavior and social dynamics. But their psychological insights extended far beyond family management. These women were among the first to grapple with existential questions that still challenge humanity today. How do you find meaning in suffering? How do you maintain hope when circumstances seem hopeless? How do you build something beautiful from materials that seem fundamentally broken? Their answers to these questions, developed through lived experience rather than abstract philosophy, provided the emotional and spiritual resources that would sustain humanity through all the dark centuries to come. They were the first grief counselors, helping family members process the trauma of Abel's murder and the ongoing pain of Cain's exile. They learned to distinguish between healthy mourning and destructive despair, between appropriate anger and consuming hatred, between realistic caution and paralyzing fear. The therapeutic techniques they developed, the healing practices they established, the wisdom they accumulated about the human heart in crisis, became the foundation of all future efforts to help people recover from trauma and loss. Their role as the first educators cannot be overstated. In a world without schools or books or formal educational institutions, the responsibility for passing knowledge from one generation to the next fell entirely on families, and within those families, primarily on mothers and sisters and aunts. These women had to figure out not just what to teach their children, but how to make that teaching effective and memorable. They were teaching survival skills, of course. Which plants were safe to eat, how to find clean water, how to make fire, how to construct shelter, how to avoid dangerous animals. But they were also teaching something far more complex. How to be human in a world that no longer supported human flourishing naturally. They had to pass on moral principles, spiritual practices, social skills, emotional intelligence, creative expression, and the capacity for hope. This dual curriculum, the practical and the transcendent, established the pattern for all future human education. The recognition that technical knowledge must be paired with character development, that information without wisdom is dangerous, that learning is as much about becoming a good person as it is about acquiring useful skills. All of this began with these forgotten mothers trying to prepare their children for life in a world that offered no guarantees of safety or success. Their pedagogical innovations were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to adapt their teaching methods to different learning styles, to use stories and songs to make important information memorable, to create hands-on experiences that would reinforce abstract concepts, to balance challenge with support in ways that would promote growth without causing discouragement. The stories they told weren't just entertainment. They were the primary vehicles for transmitting the most important truths about human existence. The tales they crafted about Eden, about the fall, about God's character and promises, about the consequences of moral choices, became the foundational narratives that would shape human understanding for millennia. Every myth, every legend, every sacred story that would emerge in cultures around the world can be traced back in some way to the oral traditions these women established and maintained. Their linguistic contributions were equally profound. Language itself was evolving rapidly in those early generations, and these women were among its primary architects. They developed vocabulary for experiences that had never existed before the fall: grief, shame, fear, loneliness, regret. They created terms for new relationships and social roles: widow, orphan, exile, refugee, stranger. They invented concepts for moral and spiritual realities that only made sense in a fallen world: justice, mercy, forgiveness, redemption, hope. The semantic foundations of human moral discourse were largely established by their need to communicate about experiences that had no precedent in paradise. The words we still use today to discuss the most important aspects of human existence, love, faith, courage, wisdom, compassion, were first given meaning by these women as they struggled to articulate truths that couldn't be learned from observation alone, but had to be discovered through relationship and suffering and hope. Their innovations in technology and craft were equally transformative. The first cooking techniques, the first methods of food preservation, the first textiles, the first pottery, the first tools for agriculture and construction. All of these emerged from their need to create livable conditions in a world that no longer automatically provided for human needs. But they weren't just adapting existing materials to new purposes. They were discovering entirely new possibilities, creating solutions that had never existed before. The first woman who realized that clay could be shaped and fired to create waterproof containers wasn't just making a useful object. She was discovering the principles of ceramics that would eventually support entire civilizations. The first woman who learned to weave plant fibers into cloth wasn't just making clothing. She was developing the textile technologies that would enable human expansion into every climate on Earth. Their agricultural innovations were particularly crucial. The ground had been cursed after the fall, producing thorns and thistles, requiring hard labor to yield its fruit. But these women learned to work with the land rather than against it, developing techniques of cultivation that could coax productivity from reluctant soil. They were the first to practice crop rotation, to understand the importance of soil health, to develop systems of irrigation and fertilization that could sustain long-term productivity. They also pioneered animal husbandry, learning to breed and care for livestock in ways that promoted both animal welfare and human benefit. They developed strategies for managing herds and flocks, for preventing and treating animal diseases, for maximizing the productivity of domesticated animals while maintaining sustainable breeding populations. Their medical knowledge, accumulated through careful observation and experimentation, laid the groundwork for all future healthcare. They were the first to recognize that certain plants had healing properties, that some practices promoted health while others caused harm, that physical and emotional well-being were interconnected, that prevention was often more effective than treatment. Their role as midwives was particularly significant. Childbirth in a fallen world was dangerous and painful, a far cry from what it would have been in Eden. These women had to learn through experience how to assist in difficult births, how to care for newborns, how to help mothers recover from the trauma of delivery. The techniques they developed, the knowledge they accumulated, the traditions they established, became the foundation of obstetric care that would save countless lives across the millennia. They were also the first mental health professionals, learning to recognize and treat the psychological wounds that come with life in a broken world. They developed strategies for dealing with depression, for managing anxiety, for helping people recover from trauma, for maintaining emotional stability in the face of ongoing stress and uncertainty. The therapeutic approaches they pioneered, refined through generations of practice, established patterns of healing that persist in various forms to this day. Their architectural innovations began with the simple need for shelter, but evolved into sophisticated understanding of how physical spaces affect human behavior and well-being. They were the first interior designers, learning to arrange living spaces for maximum comfort and efficiency. They were the first urban planners, helping to organize the growing settlements that emerged as the human population expanded beyond individual family units. When Cain built the first city and named it after his son Enoch, the women in his community would have been essential partners in this unprecedented endeavor. Cities require more than just buildings. They require systems of governance, resource distribution, conflict resolution, social organization, and cultural continuity. The expertise these women had developed in managing extended families became the foundation for managing urban communities. Their economic innovations were equally groundbreaking. In extended families where resources were limited and needs were diverse, someone had to develop principles for fair allocation, strategies for motivating productive work, methods for caring for those who couldn't care for themselves, and systems for planning for future needs while meeting present demands. These women were the first economists, developing concepts of value and exchange that would eventually evolve into complex market systems. They were the first bankers, managing family resources and making decisions about savings and investment. They were the first to grapple with questions about the relationship between individual effort and community benefit, about the balance between personal freedom and social responsibility. The legal principles that would eventually govern human societies also emerged from their need to maintain order and justice within their communities. Questions about property rights, inheritance, punishment for wrongdoing, contracts and obligations, all of these issues arose first in these early families, and the solutions that emerged established precedents that would influence legal thinking for millennia. Their understanding of justice was particularly sophisticated. Having witnessed the consequences of Cain's crime and its aftermath, they understood that wrongdoing must have consequences, but they also saw how punishment could destroy families and communities if it wasn't carefully managed. They developed concepts of proportionality, mercy, restoration, and rehabilitation that would become foundational to all future legal systems. The spiritual traditions that emerged from these early families bore the deep imprint of women's experiences and perspectives. The understanding of God as both just and merciful, as both transcendent and immanent, as both holy and loving, was shaped by mothers who had to explain divine character to children who had never experienced paradise, but still needed to maintain faith and hope. The worship practices they developed, the prayers they composed, the rituals they established, all reflected their unique position as the bridge between Eden and exile, between the memory of perfection and the reality of brokenness. They created forms of religious expression that could acknowledge suffering without surrendering hope, that could confess sin without abandoning faith, that could petition for divine help without presuming upon divine mercy. Their theological insights, developed through lived experience rather than abstract speculation, provided the foundation for all future religious thought. The questions they wrestled with: why do the innocent suffer? How can a good God allow evil? What is the purpose of human existence? How should finite beings relate to the infinite? Became the central concerns of every religious tradition that would emerge in human history. But perhaps their most remarkable achievement was the preservation and transmission of hope itself. These women lived through the most devastating transition in human history: the fall from paradise into exile, from immortality into mortality, from perfect communion with God into spiritual separation and struggle. They watched their parents age and die, saw their children make terrible choices, witnessed the gradual accumulation of suffering that comes with life in a broken world. Yet they continued to bear children, continued to build communities, continued to worship God, continued to believe that somehow, someday, the damage would be repaired and paradise would be restored. This wasn't naive optimism. They had seen too much tragedy for that. It was something deeper and more resilient, a faith that could acknowledge the reality of suffering while still maintaining hope for ultimate redemption. The songs they sang to comfort themselves and their children, the prayers they offered in moments of desperation, the stories they told to keep hope alive, the rituals they created to mark God's continuing presence and blessing. All of this created the emotional and spiritual resources that would sustain humanity through all the dark centuries to come. They were the first to develop what we might call a theology of suffering, ways of understanding pain and loss that didn't deny their reality, but placed them within a larger framework of meaning and purpose. They learned to distinguish between suffering that was meaningless and destructive, and suffering that could be redemptive and transformative. they discovered that even the worst experiences could become sources of wisdom, compassion, and strength if they were processed correctly. Their influence on human creativity and artistic expression was equally profound. The need to find beauty in a broken world, to create meaning from chaos, to express the inexpressible longings of the human heart. All of this led to innovations in music, visual arts, storytelling, and ceremonial expression that would become the foundation of all future cultural development. The first woman who arranged flowers in a pleasing pattern wasn't just decorating. She was asserting that beauty still mattered even in a fallen world, that humans had a need for aesthetic experience that went beyond mere survival. The first woman who sang a lullaby to comfort a crying child wasn't just making sounds. She was creating the musical traditions that would carry human emotion and meaning across millennia. The dances they created for celebrations, the visual symbols they developed for important concepts, the dramatic presentations they used to teach moral lessons, all of these artistic innovations served both practical and transcendent purposes. They helped bind communities together, preserved important information, provided emotional release and spiritual expression, and maintained connection with the divine even in exile from paradise. Their scientific observations and discoveries were equally significant. Living in close contact with the natural world, dependent on accurate understanding of natural processes for survival, these women became the first naturalists, the first to systematically observe and record patterns in weather, seasons, plant growth, animal behavior, and celestial movements. Their knowledge of astronomy, developed through careful observation of the night sky, enabled the creation of calendars that could predict seasonal changes crucial for agriculture. Their understanding of botany, refined through experimentation with different plants for food and medicine, laid the groundwork for both cuisine and pharmacy. Their insights into animal behavior informed the development of hunting and domestication strategies that would support growing human populations. But they weren't just passive observers of natural phenomena. They were active experimenters, testing hypotheses, refining techniques, building on previous discoveries to create new knowledge. The scientific method itself, the systematic approach to understanding the natural world through observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and verification, had its origins in the practical investigations these women conducted to solve the problems of daily survival. Their contributions to mathematics and engineering were equally foundational. The need to measure quantities for cooking and construction, to calculate ratios for mixing materials, to plan spaces for maximum efficiency, led to the development of basic mathematical concepts that would eventually support advanced civilizations. The geometric principles they discovered through practical applications became the foundation for architecture, navigation, and countless other fields. The social innovations they pioneered in those early families established patterns that would influence human organization for millennia. The division of labor they developed, the decision-making processes they created, the conflict resolution methods they established, the leadership structures they recognized, all of this became the template for more complex social organizations as human populations grew and diversified. They were the first diplomats, negotiating agreements between different family groups as the human population expanded and spread. They were the first to develop protocols for hospitality, establishing customs for welcoming strangers and incorporating newcomers into existing communities. They were the first to create systems of mutual aid and support that could help families survive unexpected disasters or periods of hardship. Their understanding of human development and psychology informed the creation of age-appropriate expectations and responsibilities that would promote healthy maturation from childhood through adulthood. The rites of passage they established, the mentoring relationships they fostered, the gradual transfer of responsibility they managed, all served to ensure that knowledge and skills would be passed successfully from one generation to the next. The marriage customs they developed balanced individual preference with family and community needs, creating stable partnerships that could survive the stresses of life in a challenging world. The child-rearing practices they established promoted both individual development and social cohesion, preparing young people to contribute effectively to their communities while maintaining their own integrity and potential. Their innovations in communication extended far beyond language development to include systems of record-keeping, message transmission, and information storage that could preserve important knowledge across time and distance. Long before writing was invented, these women developed memory techniques, mnemonic devices, and oral traditions that could maintain accuracy across multiple generations of transmission. They were the first librarians, organizing and cataloging the growing body of human knowledge. They were the first teachers, developing curricula that could efficiently transfer essential skills and information. They were the first historians, preserving accounts of important events and their significance for future generations. As we trace the threads of their influence through the subsequent development of human civilization, we begin to see how profoundly their innovations shaped everything that followed: the technologies we depend on, the social systems we participate in, the cultural traditions we inherit, the spiritual resources we draw upon, the scientific methods we employ, the artistic expressions we create. All of this can be traced back to insights and innovations that first emerged in those early families where these forgotten women lived and worked and loved and hoped. Their legacy challenges conventional narratives about how human progress occurs. Instead of the traditional story of individual genius breaking through the constraints of ignorance and tradition, we see a different model. Communities of ordinary people solving practical problems. Innovation emerging from the intersection of necessity and creativity. Wisdom generated by those whose contributions are often invisible. They remind us that the most important work in the world is often the most overlooked. That the foundations of everything we value were laid by people whose names we don't know, but whose influence we feel every day. The quiet courage of maintaining hope in hopeless circumstances, the patient work of building relationships and communities, the careful transmission of knowledge and values from one generation to the next. All of this unglamorous but essential labor was first modeled by these forgotten daughters of Eden. In our own time, when we often feel overwhelmed by the pace of change and the complexity of modern challenges, their example offers both inspiration and guidance. They faced circumstances far more daunting than anything we encounter: the complete collapse of the world they had known, the need to rebuild human civilization from scratch, the responsibility of ensuring the survival of our entire species. Yet they not only survived, but created the foundation for everything we now call progress. Their story reminds us that resilience is not just about enduring difficult circumstances, but about transforming them into opportunities for growth and development. They show us that innovation often comes not from abundance, but from constraint, not from comfort, but from necessity, not from individual brilliance, but from collective wisdom and cooperation. As we prepare to conclude our exploration of these remarkable women, we carry with us a transformed understanding of human beginnings. The familiar story of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, has revealed depths and complexities that most of us never imagined. What seemed like a simple tale of family dysfunction has opened up into a vast landscape of human achievement, creativity, and hope. The mystery of Cain's wife has led us to discover the forgotten half of human history, the stories of women whose contributions were essential to our survival and development, but whose names and achievements were lost to time. Their silence in the historical record doesn't diminish their voice in the ongoing human story. Instead, it challenges us to listen more carefully, to look more deeply, to recognize the many ways that uncredited and unremembered people continue to shape our world. These forgotten daughters of Eden were not passive victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were active agents of human development, creative problem solvers, innovative thinkers, courageous leaders, and faithful carriers of hope across the darkest chapters of our species' journey. They were the hidden architects of civilization, the unnamed heroes of humanity's greatest adventure. Their legacy lives on, not just in our DNA, but in every human achievement, every moment of beauty, every act of love and sacrifice, every glimpse of the divine in human experience. We are all their descendants, inheritors of their courage, beneficiaries of their wisdom, carriers of their hope. In honoring their memory, in attempting to recover their stories, we honor not just the past but the present, not just ancient history, but our own ongoing participation in the great human story that they began. The threads they wove into the fabric of human existence remain strong today, supporting everything we build, everything we dream, everything we hope to become. They remind us that no contribution is too small to matter, no voice too quiet to be heard, no life too ordinary to make a difference. In their forgotten names and untold stories, we find the true foundation of human dignity, human potential, and human hope. And so we conclude where we began, with a mystery that opened up into revelation, with questions that led to wonder, with the forgotten women who made all of human history possible. Their silence speaks louder than fame, their anonymity more powerful than celebrity, their hidden influence more lasting than monuments. In remembering them, we remember ourselves. In honoring them, we honor the continuing human story of which we are all a part.